Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel on operationalizing the front end. This is something that's really exciting for me for a couple of reasons. First, because it's the business we're in at Sentry and at PagerDuty where I work, and also because it really reflects kind of the maturity of some of the most interesting development we do, the development that people touch. But what's happening with operationalizing and tooling and so on reflects how the front end, the part of user experience development on the web has really matured to the point where it is an equal partner or even more important partner than with our back-end development. So I'd like to introduce our panelists, Wolfgang, Ahmad, and Raj. And I'll begin by asking each one of you to give me a super brief description. Let's go with Wolfgang first. Can you give us a really quick overview of the work that you do and your company does, and maybe touch on the ways in which your customers/users use your product?
Sure. Hi, I'm Wolfgang. I'm calling in from Austria. It's kind of evening here, already dark outside. I work for GitHub. GitHub does code hosting and allows people to interact with other people's code. I think that's how I could describe GitHub in one sentence. GitHub does slightly more than this. Beyond this, we do, collaboration and issue tracking and whatnot. There's tons of features around GitHub. Our users use GitHub mostly to, collaborate on code. You might have heard of us before. We do, open source projects. We also do closed source projects. So companies can come to us and say, hey, I want like hidden space on GitHub. And we host this for them, or they host it on their premises as well. So what I do specifically at GitHub is I manage the observability team. So we do all the observability for computers, not humans. I always say that. And we make sure that in the case, of downtime, be it front end or back end, we quickly can find, or our users, meaning our GitHub engineers, quickly can find the source of the culprits. That means we attach multiple sources there, right? Like metrics, logs, traces, and exceptions.
All right, and Ahmed, how about you? What does your company do? What is your role there? And especially, how do people interact with your company's product/service on the front end?
Sure, yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Ahmed. I'm the manager on the browser clients team here at Twitch. Twitch is, for those of you who don't know, is a live streaming platform. We like to think we're the premier purveyor of multiplayer entertainment on the web. So we have two really broad user bases, creators and viewers. Creators interact with our products by streaming their content to our video ingest servers where it gets distributed globally. And viewers interact by consuming that content by watching streams, also by participating in chat. That's a big, and various other interactive features that we have. So in terms of what my team does, we are pretty much responsible for the web client as a platform. So we build a lot of tooling, static analysis, unit testing, automation testing. We also own a lot of common UI components, and we work on documenting and evangelizing best practices and patterns kind of throughout the company, and making it easier for product teams to build delightful experiences for the web platform.
We will definitely be returning to some discussion around, the difference between, say, a feature team or that owns some sort of functionality versus a more infrastructure team that has cross-cutting concerns across the organization. So I'm glad you sort of brought that up. That is something I look forward to hearing more about from everyone on the panel. But for now, let's head over to our third of our three kings, Raj. Could you tell us a little bit about your company, your product, how people interact with it in terms of the front end and your role?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Raj, just to begin, I definitely have a stage fright, 683 audience in front of me. At the same time, I'm in my living room. So this is the best of everything possible. I work for a company called Nextdoor. Our mission is to create trusted exchanges, connections in your neighborhood hub. We are a trusted neighborhood hub for exchanges of goods, services, helpful information. I manage 2 teams at Nextdoor, systems and infrastructure. So the team that interacts with public cloud and builds on top of it, and then another team that builds even on top of it that serves the rest of the engineering and product feature teams. The way you all interact, and I hope all of you are members of Nextdoor platform, the way you all interact is through 3 channels, one being web and the second being either iOS or Android app, but we are a direct-to-consumer product, and the interaction happens through your native applications or a browser.
Fantastic. Now, I am going to be coming back and hearing a little bit more about your, more personal experiences and so on a little later on in the panel. But I thought that we would maybe start by jumping into a kind of meaty topic. In traditional development, one of the things that has evolved as we've moved towards a more iterative, lean, agile type of development, where people are working on 1-month cycles or 2-week cycles, which may, a 1-month cycle is very long by modern standards, but I remember back when we would do plans for 6 months or 1 year of development, and it was just one big monolithic thing. But as we've gone to smaller and smaller increments, that has affected the way in which we build teams, not only the way in which we manage teams, but also the way in which we actually develop our tools and our architecture, because you need a different architecture for something that you're iteratively building than you do if you're just building one big monolithic thing like some massive pyramid. So my first question to each of you, which I'd like to ask in turn, is how have you seen front-end development evolving as the ways in which we deal with the operationalizing of front ends at scale, and the ways in which we manage development remote and so on. So I'm looking for your views on the intersection between the design of the system, the operationalizing of a running system that is updated in flight, and a bit about your management. How have you seen that evolve in your career? And Wolfgang, could we come back to you first?
Sure. So how did I see this evolve? Well, I'm going to start with the end. What we have at GitHub today is GitHub is a Ruby on Rails application, a big one, and we deploy this application many times a day. So as soon as people put changes in, we start a deploy train and things roll out all the time, right? This is significantly different from what I've seen like 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, where teams, plan on features and they develop them in a corner in a test environment. At some point, they roll it out and they hope that everything is going to be, just fine. That was high risk with this. What I see today at GitHub is this very agile workflow where we actually ran into troubles because we have so many engineers working on this Ruby on Rails application that if we did a single deploy for every change that goes in, we would be in a huge queue, like everything would just queue up forever. So we batch those changes and then roll them out, because otherwise we couldn't find a better way to deploy this, right? So I think this is one of the biggest changes that I see in my position, where I just think, so many changes at a time like that are immediately tested with canaries that are slowly rolled out, and where we immediately get responses back, like in the form of graphs. I think this is a huge change to how things were 5 or 10 years ago, when people were hoping for the best testing in their browsers and maybe not even testing on the mobile devices because they forgot about it or something like this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me just as a follow-up to that, has that changed in the way you deploy things?
Absolutely.
And the way in which you get immediate feedback? Has it affected the way in which companies, GitHub or otherwise in your career, staff or organize their teams?
So a bit, I would say. I would say the thing here is that the agility, I think, comes from the small teams, right? I think the team size that I've seen shrunk over time. Like in previous company and also at GitHub, we tend to look at group of around 7 people in a team to keep it agile, to not actually plan for too much, as you said before, right? We would do like 2-week sprints and not plan ahead for a year, because that's just doesn't work today anymore, right? Like what we do at GitHub mostly is we prioritize. We look at the incoming work and say, okay, this is what the next thing we're going to work on. 2-week sprint, let's go, right? This is the way we want to have it. Not all teams are there yet, but we're getting there, right? We're slowly working towards this. So yeah, I think team size is the biggest thing I've seen here in terms of change.
All right. And Ahmed, what about your perspective? Talking to how we've evolved towards a more agile, lean, continuous deployment environment from the perspective of developing front end and customer user facing work. Have you seen changes in tooling? Have you seen changes in the way teams are organized, in the way projects are planned that go with this evolution?
Yeah, I think I could speak to that a bit. My experience, what comes to mind for me is more around team organization. In my experience, and this is probably somewhat centralized to my specific firm and all that, but we've definitely undergone a couple of significant shifts that kind of complement each other. When I first started, the company had kind of been in a mode for a while of going from a model of having centralized teams with broad responsibilities, something like the whole web platform and all the features in it. And as Twitch was growing really rapidly, we came to realize that just doesn't scale. We can only throw so many engineers on the same team with the same responsibilities and still have efficient work getting done. So the company kind of underwent this very almost like radical decentralization of teams and giving everyone these very narrow verticals to focus on with smaller teams as a way to kind of try to scale that development process. And then that's about when I come in, where we're at this peak of like the most decentralized model. And then we started to realize that we were running into tragedy of the commons style issues, where things that didn't have a clear responsibility or cut across several teams were not getting the ownership they needed. And things like centralized tooling were starting to suffer. So that's when we kind of, as a company, reworked that model a bit and created these horizontal platform teams, of which mine is one, that were kind of to be the glue between all these centralized product verticals, and responsible for maintaining the framework and kind of keeping those tragedy of the commons issues at bay. And so that, I think, has led us to a much nicer balance of having the dedicated product teams that are just really passionate and focused about their specific vertical, but then that's balanced a bit with platform teams like mine that mean that they don't have to have the really high level expertise in the framework that a lot of the front end devs on my team have.
Absolutely. And Raj, how about you? Can you speak to the issue of how in your career, not just in your current job, you've seen an evolution of front end development, especially as it relates to how our tooling has changed and how our organization has changed, reflecting, not just the more agile, lean development that's across the industry, but also the business of delivering a front end at scale.
Absolutely. And I can begin with this personal experience where I would write the DOM code or a JavaScript code on a JSP page and wait for the page to get blocked on rendering because there is a null defined or function not defined error, a yellow box at the bottom of the browser, and that's what you use to debug. We have come so far from that procedures and processes where you wait for the changes to go in production and realize you need to course correct. These days, and tools like Sentry are really helping accelerate that movement. But these days, you can use the tooling at your disposal to catch the error early enough whether it's in the staging environments or whatnot. And front-end errors were typically difficult to catch given the different browser support, the cross-platform issues, and how the DOM parser engine would be not at the same cadence at everything else. So front-end errors were, generally speaking, beyond the cosmetic changes, but difficult to catch. I have seen that change exponentially in this last 10 years or so. Now, in terms of team, I think I've seen how glamour has shifted a little bit. I would perhaps hazard a guess that the terms like a full stack developer came into being just to articulate that you can not only work on the front end stack, but can also go all the way to the back end stack. And back in the day, look at the job postings about 10 years ago, there was no front stack developer. There was no full stack developer. So I think that also has changed. That also changes how we recruit talent, how we assign them the projects, and how horizontally the teams can be. And I love the phrase tragedy of commons, which actually could happen if you do not invest in it. So that's what I see in my narrow viewpoint.
Fantastic. Well, all of that is just a setup, because of course the talking we've just been doing is mostly around the development and deployment aspect of it. But the meat of what we came here to discuss was the operationalizing. How can I forget this word? I remember, my lips don't. But we're talking about operationalizing. And operationalizing is partly about getting the code out, but it's partly also about responding to things that are happening in the real world. I'm going to guess, I'm not going to ask, I'm going to guess that none of us are developing code where everything is running on our own hardware and that we have our own electrical backups in case the power fails and so on, like old school. We're all dependent on other things. It's not necessarily even a bug of our own. The last major incident I was in at PagerDuty concerned some networking problem that AWS suddenly had between regions. But our customers were saying PagerDuty is having a problem. They didn't tell me AWS is having a problem, right? So I want to now move forward a little bit to this and ask a similar question, which is, how have you seen this evolve in terms of responding to issues from the front end perspective? I mean, I know when I first started, what was an issue? The CEO called and said, a customer called and said, there's a bug in this page, and we'd go and fix it. That isn't what we do in 2020. Wolfgang, what is the sort of GitHub approach to, in a general sense, to responding to things that we're finding live in the field?
Right. So GitHub changed their the structure around Oncall recently. We pretty much finished this rolling out. Before, like in the old days, I'm talking about a year ago, we had designated on-callers from a huge rotation that were all nervous because they were on call like once or twice a year. And they were responsible for what we call the .com stack, which is the Ruby on Rails application. And we changed this recently so that all the teams are actually responsible for their part of the code, and they're on call for their part of the code. So I happen to be incident commander at GitHub in the past, which is a role where you get paged if nothing works anymore, and then you try to coordinate this, right? And one of the outage stuff I'm part of was an interesting one where we had a collision when we created the hashes for the assets. So we created JavaScript files. There was a collision with some old file on the file name hash, and that was one reason why I can't remember exactly, but it wasn't uploaded properly or something. And that caused JavaScript verification to fail, and that caused an outage of the whole page, pretty much, right? Like things didn't work anymore, and this is when I specifically realized, holy crap, like front-end engineers have the same responsibility in their on-call as back-end engineers, right? Because if the back-end doesn't work anymore, the site doesn't work anymore. But if the front-end has a problem, and be it just a JavaScript file that has a hash collision, nothing works anymore either, right? So that is a pretty big deal, right? So front-end developers, I think, have full responsibility. And at GitHub, they're on-call just like other people. And it's like part of their job in the meantime to take the page for something that could happen on the front end side.
Take the pager. That's such a beautiful metaphor. You'd almost want to name a whole company after it. Thank you, Wolfgang.
Well, it's a duty, right? After all.
It is a duty, yes. Ahmed, maybe you can share with us, especially I'm thinking Twitch, you clearly have some high bandwidth, real-time stuff going on with streaming. Perhaps you could share with us how you've seen some of that operationalizing of the front end in terms of responding to issues and outages Can you give us a little bit of an overview and how that's evolved before or into Twitch?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we've done a lot of work on during my tenure at Twitch that I find really exciting. When I first started there, still, we were kind of in a world, we were doing continuous integration, continuous deploy. So as soon as someone merged a PR, it would kick off a deploy process that would go all the way to prod. And it was kind of a process where somebody would deploy a change, and then somebody else would come into like a big Slack channel where we, where we run our operations and say, "Hey, I think this feature's broken." And then the person would say, "Oh, that's probably my changes. Let me roll those back." And so there was this kind of, we would have very minor outages fairly often. So one of the big things that my team has really helped lock down is two aspects. First is trying to prevent those changes from ever getting merged if they have some sort of defect in them. So we expanded our linting, static analysis, unit testing, and in-browser end-to-end automation testing by like orders of magnitude. So we have tons of PR checks that run using GitHub Enterprise's very nice interface for it, so that we kind of prevent a lot of those changes from merging in the first place. But then in addition to that, we've invested a lot of time in our real-time metrics. And those are both error reports, which we send to Sentry, as well as our first-party analytics that are kind of like the opposite end of that spectrum. If there's an error, we get an error count, but we also have a really deep set of first-party analytics that tell us when things go right. Page views, video plays, minutes watched of video. Our clients are sending a lot of this telemetry to our analytic systems, and we have some really nice real-time graphing built off of Grafana, also using CloudWatch as a data source that allows us to see a lot of these, what we call business metrics, like the number of users watching video at any given time in real time, and set up alerting on those. So that if something goes wrong outside of our systems that's not associated with a deploy, like one of those infamous AWS network connectivity outages that was already alluded to, we get that information basically in real time. We get alerts also sent via PagerDuty usually to the owning team. And we have a pretty solid structure of who owns what, so we know where to direct those pages. And we also have a similar system as to what Wolfgang mentioned, where feature teams, even their front-end engineers, are on call. So we can route those pages to somebody who's an expert in the system involved and can help triage and resolve it.
Fantastic. This sounds like there's a lot of maturity that has happened, in your organization, which correct me if I'm wrong, but if we were to travel back in time and talk to Ahmed 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Ahmed from minus 15 years would be surprised at where the front end has gone. Am I right about that?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So let's check in and find out what has happened, Raj, in the last 10, 15 years in your own career in terms of the maturity of the front end operationalizing, especially especially with respect to whether it be incidents or feedback for marketing purposes or design, or basically this interaction with a live piece of software running with users hitting on it in real time. How has that matured in your experience?
It's greatly improved, and maybe not so great for the front-end engineers, because I recall a time where they were not on call, and now regardless of what engineer you are, if things break, everybody's required to participate depending on their role. So that I have seen that no matter what stack, whether you're SRE, operator in a traditional sense, a systems engineer, or whether you're the feature developer, everybody is going to participate if something breaks. The second thing that I've seen is the definition of outage itself has broadened. Now, again, it depends on the culture and the company, but it's no longer your site is down or giving you a server error. It's anything that you care about. So the metrics have a definition of whether it's a 2% of your traffic that errors out, or it crosses a certain load time, which is no longer acceptable to your business. Any of that generates a page and a real-time alarm that ends up being an incident. And this is where I think all the Silicon Valley companies and all the recent understanding of how best to improve human performance, the blameless retros, where regardless of what break, who made what change, whatnot, let's gather enough information and instrument it for the next time around. So at Nextdoor in particular, for the last 6 months and before then, what I've seen is every time something breaks down, it's an opportunity to increase your observability, to increase additional metrics that you can watch on, and create instrumentation. Once you ingest the data, the telemetry, once you send the telemetry data, make sure you have a graphing and some capability that allows you to trigger an alarm. Fortunately, we use PagerDuty. We also use Sentry. And the shift that I've seen in recent past is to balance, because now you have just too many things that you're ingesting. And this is the staleness of data. After a week or two, it's no longer a JavaScript exception error is no longer interesting bit to me. And I would end up paying the price if I don't either delete it or course correct on it in real time. So I also have seen the shift now where, of course, instrument everything, ingest all possible telemetry data, but balance it with the usage and discard the noise after a reasonable amount of time. So those are some of the things I've seen in recent past.
That's great. All three of you have mentioned a transition to DevOps and to going on call. We especially heard about the distinction between an incident commander and an ordinary, if you want to call it that, responder. One of the things I can share, from PagerDuty, is that we think of incident commanding as being a skill, just like any other skill. It can be learned, it can be trained, you can get feedback on it, you can improve it, you can screw it up, you can, and so on. And that maybe segues to an interesting area that we can talk about. When we talk about operationalizing, it's obviously easy to fall into things like, well, install Sentry and PagerDuty, you're on your way. But there's also changes in the way you look at things, such as, what does onboarding look like in a world where people are expected to wind up going on call? It's more than just, here's our stack of libraries that we like to use with JavaScript, right? What does ongoing career development look like in a world where you have DevOps responsibilities as well as coding responsibilities, where you have incident commander responsibilities, which is a team sport, right? An incident commander exists when there's multiple people, as opposed to just going off in the corner, putting together your pull requests, deploying it. So if I could come back around and starting with Wolfgang. Wolfgang, can you talk a little bit about, have there been changes at GitHub, for example, in terms of how people's career and development, what that looks like in a world where we're operationalizing the front end and not just writing code?
Right. Yeah. I happen to be part of a small work group that invests into the onboarding experience in GitHub. And one of the things that we realized is that people come on board, they get to know the very basics, and then they put out there to the teams and they have to write code and deploy it. However, it's a bit scary if what Ahmad mentioned, we have also all these unit tests and system tests, and we have lab environments where you can see what you change before you roll things out. However, the first rollout that you do is scary for people that are not coming from huge companies or whatever, from people that haven't done this before. They're scared to death to roll out the changes. So what we invested in on the onboarding side is that we have built an environment, something that is in production but not super important, that people are actually using. But if it's down, nobody really it doesn't really matter too much. And the onboarding group gets a couple of tasks, they have a couple of issues that they need to resolve with this, right? With this application, and then they write code against this and they deploy to real production, right? That helps them to get a feeling how it is to deploy to production. Also, it gives them a feeling for the tooling at GitHub. We use lots and lots of JetOps. So there is no web UI that you go to and you click rollout. No, you have to type a command against the ubot, and ubot will then do its thing. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. Depends on what code you wrote. And so that is an experience that I think is important for people to get when they onboard. That is an experience that helps them to not be that painful, to be more confident about, okay, at least I know what to do, right? At least I know the right steps. Of course, we have peer review as well in the coding, right? But that gives them this extra confidence boost to go to their first real rollout, production rollout, and be pretty fine that it's good. It's a good experience, right? So I've just experienced a new starter. She started maybe 3 weeks ago, and she found that there was a space too much somewhere on the GitHub page, and she was like, I'm gonna fix this, right? But she's not a front-end developer or working on the .com Rails application. So she went in there and bravely made her change, and then she was super afraid to deploy it, like just removing a single space. But yeah, that's what happens, right?
I do remember my first GitHub commit when I first worked there. I think I fixed, there was a test bug that it broke when there was when the tests were run in February of leap year. There was a bug because it had some sort of weird dependency that had to do with the way Rails date math worked, and it happened to break, and I fixed it so that it would be resilient to leap years. That was my possibly the best code I ever wrote at GitHub. Yes, that onboarding experience, I'm glad you brought it up, because you didn't just talk about the sort of technical things that have to happen, but you also talked about making it comfortable for people, which is important, because people who are stressed out don't do good work. And we're in a business, we don't just make widgets, at a table. We actually have to be using our creativity and our energy, and anything that's stressful takes away from that. So as I turn to Ahmed, perhaps I could ask you, if you didn't already intend to not just talk about, what's happening with career and personal development at Twitch, but also maybe to speak to, if you have some opinion or wisdom to share with us about what it is that how it is that the organization is working to help keep this from being stressful and difficult for people working at Twitch.
Sure, yeah, I think I could do that. So this is another thing that's kind of near and dear to my heart, because my team is also responsible for the onboarding process. When a new developer joins Twitch and wants to make a change to the website, getting them up and running is kind of part of our purview. So first off, we invest a lot of time in our docs. That's probably the biggest single change that we've made in my tenure there that has really helped. Docs always take extra time. They always go out of date, but having them is so much better than not having them. So we found it really worthwhile to invest engineer time in keeping the docs up to date. We also have some technical writer resources specifically designated with helping us keep our internal doc site up to date. So that's kind of step one. Another thing that's been successful kind of culturally at Twitch in the last couple of years is Runbooks, is having playlists for how to do all these different processes, really well defined. If you go into a new service or project, kind of where to find its Runbooks. They're in the same place in the repository or in the same place in the wiki that's linked to the repository. So having Runbooks for all the processes you could possibly need to go into. So if something is on fire, it's just a matter of following this nice numbered set of steps. That really reduces the stress level of on-call, I think. But then just having the Runbooks isn't quite sufficient. We also really have tried to push a culture of doing game days, of setting up almost like artificial incidents such that you can make sure these Runbooks work in a situation that isn't as high stress. So maybe we take a staging environment and we do a failover from the primary DB to the replica, but we'll go through all the steps just as if it were a production outage that we were trying to resolve, but nothing is really on the line. And that really helps the engineers who are going through the Runbook to gain that confidence, kind of like Wolfgang was alluding to as well. Like they've already done it once. So when it comes time to do it, and when there is a fire, it's not quite as stressful. And then another part of that is having training. I think that's a place where we're fortunate to be part of the Amazon organization. So we have access to a lot of great internal training that is around AWS, around a lot of the other tools we use. So just having a culture that encourages employees to take the time to watch a seminar, to go to a conference, to read a blog post, maybe work on a side project that is related to their team, but not part of their roadmap right now. Those are all kinds of just having a culture that doesn't penalize people for taking that time to never stop learning, I think is another big portion of it too.
That's absolutely fantastic. If I didn't work at PagerDuty, I'd be trying right now to write up my resume for both GitHub and Twitch. And no doubt, as soon as I've heard from Raj, same thing for Nextdoor. Raj, could you give us a sort of look at what your organization is doing in terms of operationalizing from the perspective of personal development, career development, personal development, training, onboarding, and so on?
Absolutely. And let me put this plug right out there. Not only you, but all the other participants can apply at Nextdoor. We are hiring. I'm hiring in particular. And I updated my LinkedIn profile just yesterday to make a point about it. Now, going back to what we are doing as an organization to invest in a career development, right? So I think similar to what we discussed about making mistakes or making it easier to make mistakes. It's my job. It's not a nice to have, or it's not a good management style. It is my absolute job to make it psychological safe. And we mention psychological safety as one of the workplace trait, but it's absolutely my job to make it safe both ways, for the employee to make mistakes and for the company to afford the mistakes. So I'll give an example of aviation, where the planes fly 2 mistakes high. So if you have adverse weather, inclement anything, if the plane drops to a level where the pilot cannot recover the altitude, there would be a bad outcome. Therefore, they fly 2 mistakes high. So if there is a mistake and another mistake after that, that is the thing that you cannot recover from. So we have to translate that for engineering, where we make it safe, where you where the consequence or outcome of your mistake would be minimal to the organization, whether it's a cost, whether it's, oh, somebody just spun up a resource and didn't realize how many IOPS credit we consumed, and that created a huge bill. Or whether, oh, this bucket, if it's leaked accidentally to the public, how safe it is to recover the data or recover the damage. But in any case, as a company, what we, in the blameless retrospections is another thing, but anything that we can do to make it safer for people to experiment and learn. In fact, that's one of our value, experiment and learn quickly. Those are some of the things we invest as a company to make it safe for people to grow into their career. And your bit about the stressfulness doesn't allow you to be the creative. That's so important. Like, tech is an industry of creatives, whether you're an individual contributor or a manager, everybody is a creative, and the stress has no place in it. So it's our job to design for it.
Got you. Now we've got about 5 minutes left, and traditionally the moderator gets the last word because he's supposed to be some pompous person. We're not going to do that today, so I'm going to do my last word, and then I'm going to give each of you a last opportunity to speak. What I've heard today, as much as I'd love to say it's all about having the fantastic tools, but what I've heard today really is that it's the way in which companies and teams organize around the tools that makes it effective. Whether it be practices like at PagerDuty, we call them Failure Fridays. Ahmed, you had a different word for it, which involves practicing things before they happen, whether it involves a particular type of onboarding, as Wolfgang spoke to, or whether it involves people in management or responsibilities actually sitting down and saying, hey, psychological safety is as important as the number of bugs per minute or whatever in order for us to be successful. It's not just Sentry or PagerDuty or DevOps, but it's also the holistic approach that is what makes operationalizing the front end successful. Am I getting nods from all three of you on that? Okay, in that case, let's have a little fun with our closing remarks. You each have 1.5 to 2 minutes to tell me about the worst incident you've experienced in your current job. Wolfgang, tell me about the time everything was on fire.
Yeah, it's my last job though, where it was really on fire. So one of the examples, I used to be an SRE at Google, and one of the things that happened there was that while Gmail was rather new, I believe, it was working fine, and at some point, someone deployed something bad, I assume. It went down, and what happened was that the front-end code of Gmail, which was JavaScript heavy, tried to hide that the backend was down. So what they implemented is like, just show us if everything is fine and talk to the backend. Every 5 seconds, try to connect to the backend, right? Every 5 seconds, try it. So when the Gmail SREs finally brought up the backends again, what happened was the perfect storm. So it was a DDoS attack on our infrastructure back then, because they never sized the system for the amount of requests that queued up, right? Because usually when you say email, people open up the UI and they do some interactions and they go away. But in this case, the storm was so huge that any data center they brought up was again brought down again by the huge load that was produced. What I want to say here is front-end developers exponential backoff is the one thing you wanna take care of when you talk to your backend. You always want to do exponential backoff if you have more than one user, please.
All right, Ahmed, 90 seconds. Worst time everything started melting and you were just sitting in a puddle of melted plastic and computer parts.
Sure. I do wish I had I thought of a better example of this because we've had some real humdingers in terms of just like multiple systems interacting with each other in a really terrible way. But the one that's coming to mind right now and is very related to front end is kind of a different flavor. To what Wolfgang mentioned, rather than it being an error case that was not handled correctly, though, this was a case of a front-end developer not really understanding how our dynamic configuration in our app worked exactly. And so what we did is they released a new feature that they were planning to roll out to users incrementally, like 1% of users and then 2% of users, maybe 10% for a couple of weeks to see how it was going. And over that time, they're getting a in production load test with real traffic of their service that's backing this feature, right? So they were expecting this slow ramp up of traffic. But when they released the front end code, they had the UI hidden behind what we call a feature flag, like a dynamic configuration or experiment or whatever you want to call it. But they didn't gate the API call. They thought they had, but they hadn't. So they released a feature on our channel page, our number one, our highest traffic route. And so their service, which they were expecting to get, a few RPS, was suddenly getting on the order of hundreds of thousands of requests per minute. Just with every load of the channel page. And it immediately knocked their service over and in the state where it was having a lot of trouble recovering until we could shut that traffic back off. But of course, that required deploying the client code because, again, we should have a switch where we could just turn that feature off, but they didn't implement that configuration of the switch quite correctly. So we were stuck with their service being knocked over. Fortunately, no impact on users, but it created quite the fire drill for the service owners who were just utterly confused as to why they were in production all of a sudden. And we call that the free load test.
What a great story. Raj, could I get real quick from you, worst time that the entire building collapsed and you just found yourself and your desk surrounded by rubble in every direction?
Yes, and it was also late night, a Saturday morning to be precise. This is prior to Nextdoor, where we were trying to migrate off of Colo or on-prem servers to a cloud, one of the public cloud, and it was obviously a complicated migration. At the same time, we believed we had all ducks in a row, cut over plans, verified, validated. We had only one DB engineer who was employed at the company at the time, and he was responsible for doing the DB steps. And once the DBs are migrated, you make sure the downstream systems, your analytics systems, have the data that they're looking for. The migration, of course, ran into some issues. This was a MySQL, and we were going to the RDS managed engines, whatnot. So it ran into issues, but as we were making past the midnight and around 1 in the morning, where it was the time to smoke test and make sure everything is working correctly, one of the analytics system, BI system, we realized the records were off by certain hours. And then after a while, we realized it was about the timestamp issue. It was so ugly issue where we had to wake up some business owners and decide what to do with it, because there was no way to go back. And if we were to move forward, the rollback versus roll forward, the choice was to bulk update the records because we were, whether it's a Pacific time zone versus UTC time zone, and one of the column had this mismatch of what it was expecting versus what was given. And we had to make a business decision Saturday morning about whether we going forward, whether we go to the UTC format or a PT format. But that's something I really reflect back as something that was really ugly, and we didn't know what would happen tomorrow.
Fantastic. Well, we are now at 1 minute and 15 seconds over our allotted time, which in some industries is terrible, but as far as software is concerned, it's some sort of a world record for on-time delivery, I believe. But we do have a couple of questions from the audience. And one of them, the first one, I'd like to share with you. I think this is one of these things that could be a full day conference unto itself with workshops. And that question is this. When tackling incidents on the front end, is it easier, different to catch? What is the difference between finding and fixing deploys for statically generated pages versus client rendered apps? And before you answer that, I really want to praise this question because it's kind of specific about rendered versus dynamic pages, but there's a larger thing which again I feel could be a conference unto itself, and perhaps Sentry will put that on one day, which is when designing software, what do we do? How do we design software so that it's easier to fix in production? Feels to me like that's a whole, at least a day unto itself. But could I ask one of the panelists perhaps to give their opinion, whoever wants to buzz in first, as to is there a difference between working with statically rendered stuff versus dynamically rendered as far as deploying and fixing issues in the field? Hearing no buzzards, I'm just going to call on Wolfgang.
So this is just my opinion, right? I'm not the front-end specialist, but I think both of them have their catches. As I said before, like the statically generated JavaScript had a hash collision on GitHub. It was hard to debug because there's no tool that tells you that you can't load JavaScript because it's not verified, right? This was not trivial, right? If we had built this on the back end, or dynamically built the JavaScript, I mean, first of all, we would have had a load problem. But if we would ignore the load problem, we would probably have seen this better, right? But yeah, both of them have their pros and cons, and I wouldn't, I mean, my personal preference is always render everything statically that you can, just because it will make you faster and more resilient to any type of attacks when it comes to security or whatever. But yeah, I think there's no generic answer to this, to be honest.
I know what you mean about rendering everything. My own blog is statically generated, and my biggest reason for doing that is I don't want to go on call for my hobby.
Same here.
We have one more question. I personally will take a first crack at it, and then I'll ask if any of you have an opinion about it. And the second question was regarding documentation, which is a great thing because documentation is fantastically important, not just in terms of how useful it is, but also the very act of documenting something makes you engage with it and think about it. And sometimes when documenting something, I stop documenting and go back and redo the thing I'm documenting because I realize it's not great. But regarding documentation, can anyone recommend modern tools for diagramming the models of a front-end architecture? Does anyone have much experience with doing diagrams for most of their docs rather than purely text comments? My initial comment will be, I've used a bunch of tools and use all sorts of tools at work like Lucidchart and so on for collaboration, and a number of them are great. I personally love tools that as old school as this is, that take some sort of text input and turn it into visual graphics, going back to, GraphViz and so on to more modern things, LaTeX, because that allows me to check my work into GitHub. And do pull requests and diffs with it and use a bunch of other things in the tooling chain. That's my initial response. But maybe I want to ask if Ahmed or Raj have something to share in terms of tooling that you use for documenting models, architecture, and so on for the front.
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in on this one. I would love to plug Plant UML. It's a specific flavor of UML, which I believe is Universal Markup Language. It's a and it fulfills that that need you just described, where you write code, basically has a very simple syntax, and then I think it is actually also based on GraphViz. A layer on top of GraphViz will make that into very neat flowcharts, sequence diagrams, directed graphs. There's several other diagram types you can use, and I use that all the time. I'm actually in the middle of writing up a bunch of sequence diagrams today, of all things. I'm updating some of the sequence diagrams for our authentication flows, and I love using the text-based system of Plant UML offers, because in addition to checking the code in and checking the diffs and getting a review on it, I can copy paste. If there's a section in one chart that I want in another chart, you just copy paste it over. It's very clean. So yeah, that's really my go-to. I couldn't plug that enough.
Yeah, and I'll finish by saying that if you were to check out my blog at ragenwald.com, you'll actually see examples of places where I've written code that looks at a particular model and then generates the sort of 3D version from that. So being able to go from code and from data to diagrams is also incredibly an interesting field, which is probably a profession unto itself. However, as exciting as this is, there's even more exciting stuff coming from this conference. So we should allow our audience to have a little bit of a break and move on to it. I'd like to thank Wolfgang, Ahmed, and Raj, who joined us from GitHub, Twitch, and Nextdoor, respectively, for sharing your valuable time and experience. They say that as you become more senior in the industry, people are less interested in your hands and your brain, more interested in the scar tissue you bring to the job. And I've definitely seen the evidence of the scar tissue and experience that you've had in your career, in addition to the brains that you're bringing here. So on behalf of PagerDuty, Sentry, and the audience, I want to thank you all very, very much, and wish you well in your careers going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.